Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more Know Your Supreme Court Judicial Branch. I was about to call it Know Your Members of the Supreme Court. It is essentially the same thing. Anyway, we're trying to catch up here where this last week it's been hell week for me. Uh, anyway, before we jump into the video, I do want to go ahead and remind you, if you are so inclined to donate to the channel, we have two ways to do so. We have a Patreon account, which is a month-to-month monthly donation system. And we have a coffee account, which can do much the same, but also allows you to make single one-time donations. I'll be putting links to both in my description box below the video. If you are in financial stress, please do not donate. I'd rather you take care of what you need to take care of, especially with being as how the idiots are in charge and fucking everything up. But if you are able to afford it and you wish to donate, thank you. I really do appreciate it. It's me, myself, and I do the research, the filming, the editing, the posting, all that good stuff. And so far, I've sworn off commercials and get no money as of yet for the videos themselves. So yeah, it's kind of just something I do out of what I feel is a necessity to do. But with that said, let's go ahead and hop into the video here. Today we're looking at the last two members to join. I believe we were looking at the Melville Fuller court. I believe that's who we were looking at. Yep. And that means we'll be looking at the cases, and then we'll be getting into the Edward Douglas White court. But let's go ahead and look at today's two justices to fill out Fuller court. We have Horace Harmon Lurton, justice from the state of Tennessee, replacing Peckham, Rufus W. Peckham. And we have Charles Evans Hughes, Justice of New York, who was replacing Brewer. David J. Brewer. So yeah. Both justices were approved through acclamation, just meaning pretty much the Senate was like, yep, they're all good choices, great picks. You don't see that kind of shit anymore because the partisan bullshittery that is America. Anyway, I already forgot who we were talking about. Lurton was on the bench for 4 years, 204 days, from January 3rd, 1910 to July the 12th, 1914. And Charles Evans Hughes was on the bench for 5 years, 244 days, from October the 10th, 1910 to June the 10th, 1916. Lurton would die while on the bench, but Evans Hughes resigned, not retired. So you kind of wonder what happened that forced him to make the decision to resign. But he would be the last of the judges to take the bench under Fuller, because just 2 months later, we get a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Edward Douglas White. So, yeah. Horace Harmon Lurton. Let's take a look at him first from supreme.justia.com. Justice Horace Harmon Lurton joined the Supreme Court January 3rd, 1910, replacing Rufus Willer Peckham. And he was born February 26, 1844, in Newport, Kentucky. He attended the old University of Chicago, but returned to the South to serve in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. After the war ended, he received a law degree from the Cumberland School of Law, now part of Samford University, in 1867. Entered private practice in Tennessee, but eventually took a position as Chancellor of the Tennessee Chancery Court in the 6th Judicial District in 1875, and served in his role for 3 years before returning to private practice. Became a justice on the Tennessee Supreme Court in 1886, and 7 years later, President Grover Cleveland nominated him to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th Circuit. He spent 16 years on this federal court, and toward the end of his tenure there, he spent a few years as the dean of the law department of Vanderbilt University. On December 13, 1909, President William Howard Taft nominated Lurton as his first nominee to the Supreme Court. Taft himself had previously served with Lurton on the 6th Circuit Court. Yeah, remember, William Howard Taft, big law guy. He himself would be on the Supreme Court after his tenure as president. So yeah, not surprising that he worked with Lurton. He knew him very well. The Senate confirmed him December 20th, and he took his judicial oath shortly after New Year's itself. So he spent just 4.5 years on the court, writing 87 opinions, but did not have a significant influence on the development of the law. Died July the 12th, 1914, in Atlantic City, New Jersey, during a summer recess of the court. Was returned to Tennessee for burial and replaced by James Clark McReynolds. So yeah, Justice Horace Harmon Lurton. Let's go ahead and look at Oyez. Man of the South, born in Kentucky, raised in Tennessee, attended the University of Chicago, returned to fight to the South to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Captured, escaped, then captured again. Sick with tuberculosis, his mother successfully petitioned Lincoln to release her son to her care. He later attended Cumberland Law School, as we mentioned, now Samford University, and entered law practice in Clarksville, Kentucky. I'm assuming Kentucky. It might be Tennessee. Anyway, his hometown. Served Tennessee Supreme Court 7 years. Appointed to the Court of Appeals by Grover Cleveland. colleague of William Howard Taft, like we said, and when elected president, Taft made Lurton his first appointment to the Supreme Court. Like we said, didn't have much impact on the Supreme Court and on law itself. Mainly dealing most of his actual talent with procedural issues for employer liability cases. Born Newport, Kentucky, February 26, 1844. Died July 12, 1914. English ethnicity, Episcopalian, was the religion, upper middle class, family status. Mother, Sarah Ann Harmon, and father, Lycurgus Lurton. His father was a physician and Episcopal minister. So yeah, a little bit more about who Horace Harmon Lurton was as an individual. Circuit Court Judge for the Appeals Court of the Sixth Circuit and of the United States Circuit Courts for the Sixth Circuit. So he spent a lot of time in the federal courts, Sixth Circuit on appeals and circuit courts. I'm not sure what the difference is between the old University of Chicago, known as, so it's still just the University of Chicago, 1856 to 1886. Okay. Received a Bachelor of Laws in 1867 from Cumberland Law School. Now a part of Samford University. Served in the Confederate States Army as a sergeant major, 5th Tennessee Infantry at the age of 17. Petitioned to get out because of ill health. Later served as a private in the 2nd Kentucky Infantry and 3rd Kentucky Cavalry, 1862 to 1865. Yeah, twice captured by Union forces, second time prisoner of war to Johnson's Island prison camp in Sandusky Bay, Ohio. Paroled by Lincoln because of pleas from the mother. Yeah. Although this was merely an anecdote, he often repeated it to dinner guests, according to historian Roger Long. So that may not even have been true. Long explains in detail that the evidence shows in an article he wrote in the December 8, 1994 edition of the Civil War Times that apparently he was paroled from Johnson's Island only when he signed an oath of allegiance, not because of any act of the president. Article includes interesting details about Lurton's service as well as possible reasons for the anecdote he was so fond of repeating. I'm sure he wanted to try to say, hey, I still have allegiance to the South. But anyway, yeah. Private practice, Clarksville, Tennessee. Chancellor for the Tennessee Chancery Court, 6th Judicial District. Returned to private practice after 3 years on the Chancery Court. Tennessee Supreme Court, 86 to 93. And then elected Chief Justice of the court, the Tennessee Supreme Court. But only served for 2 months in that position. Was nominated by President Grover Cleveland. Served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit and the U.S. Circuit Courts for the Sixth Circuit, vacated by Judge Hal Edmonds Jackson. Confirmed by the Senate, March 27th, 1893. And would end his time there December 20th, 1909, due to being given his position on the Supreme Court. While on the Sixth Circuit, he was also Dean of Law Department at Vanderbilt Law, 1905 to 1909. At the age of 65, he was the oldest associate justice ever by initial appointment. So when you think of justices to the Supreme Court, late 40s through their 50s. But at 65, yeah, he was unnormally older for the position to get his initial appointment. Also, as a Supreme Court justice, he was a circuit justice for the Second Circuit, circuit justice for the Third, for the Seventh, and then he would die in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Sided most frequently with Associate Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Most notable opinion was likely the opinion of the court in Cole versus Smith, holding that the federal government could not tell a state where to locate its capital, as all states must be on equal footing. Yeah, remember, federal government has certain rights that supersede states, but it cannot tell states what to do in a lot of cases because the states still have a lot of ability to make their own decisions, do what they want. World War II, the Liberty ship SS Horace S. Lurton, built in Brunswick, Georgia, and named in his honor. But yeah, that's been a look at Horace Harmon Lurton. With that said, let's look at the final justice under the Melville Fuller Court, Charles Evans Hughes. Joined October 10th, 1910, replacing David Josiah Brewer, and after 6 years of service, he resigned and spent a period of time away from the court before returning as Chief Justice February 24th, 1930, replacing Chief Justice William Howard Taft. Interesting. So he actually does come back. So it isn't necessarily, well, we still don't know fully why he resigned, if it was just a personal decision to leave or whatever. But yeah, okay. So he would come back to the Supreme Court after being away for a while. Born April 11th, 1862, in a small city on the Hudson River in New York State. However, his family later moved to New York City, and he attended Madison University, now Colgate University, from 1876 to 1878, but received undergraduate degree from Brown University in Rhode Island in 1881. Graduated from Columbia Law School 3 years later, and over the next 2 decades, blended a career in private practice with some forays into legal academia and tutored law students at Columbia for a few years before after he graduated, and taught for 2 years in the 1890s at Cornell Law School. In 1906, defeated William Randolph Hearst in the New York gubernatorial election. Okay. Was reelected as governor in New York in 1908, but did not complete his second term. And on April the 25th, 1910, nominated by President William Howard Taft to the U.S. Supreme Court. Senate confirmed him by acclamation May the 2nd, and he took his judicial oath in the fall. Wrote one of his most notable opinions during his first time on the court in Houston, East and West Texas Railway Company versus the U.S. Voicing a broad interpretation of congressional power under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. But he would resign from the court just only serving under 6 years to run for president. Okay, so he wanted to run for president. That's why he left. Justice John Heston Clark replaced him on the court. In a tightly contested election, Hughes would lose to incumbent Woodrow Wilson and returned to private practice for a few years before joining the cabinet of President Warren G. Harding, serving as Secretary of State in 1921. Continued that role under President Calvin Coolidge after Harding died in 1923, but resigned in 1925 and again returned to private practice. Between 1928 and 1930, served as on the Permanent Court of International Justice, which was part of the League of Nations, the precursor to what we now know as the United Nations. It was the first attempt at something like that, the League of Nations was, if you didn't know who they were. February the 3rd, 1930, President Herbert Hoover nominated Hughes to serve as Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. The Senate confirmed in a 52-26 vote, and he took the judicial oath later that month. One of the only 2 associate justices, and the only associate justice since 1800, who left the court and returned to serve as Chief Justice. So, only 2 justices served as associate justices, leave the court, and then come back to serve as Chief Justice. And he was the most recent. So interesting. Served as Chief Justice for slightly over a decade. tenure largely coincided with the New Deal of President Franklin Roosevelt. Many of the key cases of the era involved the constitutionality of economic regulations. We'll focus away from his time as Chief Justice because we're just focusing on his term as the Associate Justice. Left the Supreme Court June 30th, 1941, replaced by Justice Harlan Fiske Stone, and has been one of the three musketeers who had been one of the three musketeers on the Hughes court in the 1930s. Hughes died August 27, 1948, in Massachusetts and buried in New York City. 39, 39, 38, 38, 37, 37, 37, 35, 35, 34, 32, 31. There's the one case for his first term. Houston East and West Texas Railroad Company versus the U.S. of 1914, dealing with the powers of Congress in taking measures necessary to foster and protect interstate commerce. It may be necessary for Congress to control the interstate transactions of interstate carriers. So yeah, Congress can't control the action within a state, but if you have to travel across state borders, they have that power. That's a well-confirmed power. So if you travel interstate or intrastate, between states, over borders, it's something Congress can deal with. Now let's look at Oye. Born and raised in New York, educated by his parents, but matriculated at Madison College, now Colgate, when he was 14. Completed his undergraduate education at Brown, taught briefly before entering Columbia Law School, and scored an amazing 99.5 on his bar exam at the age of 22. So clearly, highly intelligent. Knew what he was doing. Practiced law in New York for 20 years, though he did hold an appointment at Cornell Law School for a few years in that period. Earned national recognition for his investigation into illegal rate making and fraud in the insurance industry, and with the endorsement of Theodore Roosevelt, he ran successfully for New York governor, defeating William Randolph Hearst in 1906. In 1910, he accepted nomination to the High Court from President Taft. And 6 years later, resigned to run against Woodrow Wilson for the presidency as the nominee of the Republican and Progressive parties, and lost by a mere 23 electoral votes. So he wasn't that far from being a president. This guy is kind of an unknown dark horse in American political history. Interesting. After a brief stint in private practice, called to politics again, this time as Secretary of Warren G. Harding, and continued in this role during the presidency of Calvin Coolidge, nominated to be Chief Justice. met with opposition from Democrats who viewed Hughes as too closely aligned with corporate America. Their opposition was insufficient, though, to deny the Senate chair, and Hughes authored twice as many constitutional opinions as any other member of his court. His opinions, in the view of one commentator, were concise and admirable, placing him in the pantheon of great justices. He had remarkable intellect and social gifts that made him a superb leader and administrator, and a photographic memory that few, if any, of his colleagues could match. He was generous, kind, and forbearing in an institution where egos generally come in only one size: extra large. Born April 2nd, 1862 in Glens Falls, New York. Died August 27th, 1948. Was English, from England. Baptist. Family was middle class. I'm surprised it wasn't upper middle, or upper class or upper middle as it tends to often be. Just middle class. Mother was Mary C. Connolly, father David C. Hughes. His father was a Baptist minister. Now let's dig through Wikipedia here, see if there's anything of necessity to look at. 30 to 41, the 11th Chief Justice. As we've already said, an Associate Justice before that. 36th Governor of New York, 1907 to 1910. 44th U.S. Secretary of State, 1921 to 1925. Republican nominee for the 1916 presidential election, narrowly losing to Woodrow Wilson as the incumbent. So this was when Wilson was looking to get reelected. The first term, he had to fight off Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft to get elected the first term. And when he's looking for re-election, he had to face off against this man, Charles Evans Hughes. Okay, father was Welsh, which is the little dot here on the bottom of England. Towards the bottom of the nation, so yeah. Private investigation or state investigations into public utilities and the life insurance industry. Serving under Harding and Calvin Coolidge, negotiated the Washington Naval Treaty, which was designed to prevent a naval arms race among the U.S., the U.K., and Japan. Would leave office in 1925 and return to private practice, becoming one of the most prominent attorneys in the country. Um, bu- 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 The Hughes court struck down several New Deal programs, but marked a turning point for the Supreme Court and the New Deal as Hughes and Roberts joined with the Three Musketeers to uphold the Wagner Act and a state minimum wage law. Inspired by the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, His father was inspired by it, rather. And they moved from Wales to the U.S. in 1855. And Charles David Hughes was born in 1862. Family would move to Oswego, New York in 1866, and soon after Newark, New Jersey, and then Brooklyn. At the age of 14, entered Madison University, Colgate University, studying for 2 years and transferred to Brown, graduating third in his class at the age of 19. So again, highly intelligent. Volunteered for the successful 1880 presidential campaign of Republican nominee and fraternity brother James A. Garfield. So yeah, he was well connected. Even though he's only middle class, he was well connected with some big names. Which is always, if you have thoughts of moving up, always good to have those kind of relationships. While still president, Teddy Roosevelt nominated Hughes, I would probably say suggested Hughes to be governor of New York for the Republicans. Described as a progressive conservative, Roosevelt described Hughes as a sane and sincere reformer who really who really has fought against the very evils which Hearst denounces, but is free from any taint of uh, demagogy. Yeah, William Randolph Hearst. He is one of the names for whom yellow journalism is most well known. He was a newspaper publisher. Uh, I can't remember how far down the line she was from him, but Patty Hearst was his relative, the woman who got kidnapped in the 70s, 1970s, I'm saying. So yeah, yeah. Associate Justice. We talked about he was only on there for just under 6 years. So he was kind of the follow-up choice after Wilson beat both Taft and Roosevelt. Even though you see so many states being one color, remember, the more populous states are up here. Look at the numbers. New York, 49. Pennsylvania, 38. Illinois, 29. And this is still when California and Texas were young, 20, 13. So it's their biggest prize was Ohio at 24. For Hughes though, he was winning all the big states up here. where a lot of the economy and power of the nation was. He didn't lose by a lot, though. What did we say? It was only a 23 electoral vote difference. But Hughes would return to practicing law, serve as Secretary of State. The Banana Wars. This is literally the Chiquita Banana Company dealing with Panama and stuff, where they actually had to send in military, if I remember right. Is that the same? German economy struggled, blah, blah, blah. Closer relationship with the UK, Latin America, Dominican Republic, Panama, Costa Rica. But basically, a lot of your banana producing nations in the central Latin America, Central America, and so even some Caribbean nations like the Dominican Republic. So, yeah. But I believe that was the same time when the Chiquita Banana Company was making so much money from that region of the continents there by getting bananas from there. It's like, really? I may be wrong on that. I do want to go ahead and make it clear I easily could be wrong on that, but I believe that's the same thing, the same time. Blah, blah, blah. During his retirement, refrained from re-entering public life or giving advice on public policy, but agreed to review the United Nations charters. Because remember, the League of Nations, after the First World War, which was attempting to do what the United Nations would end up doing, making a world government of sorts, failed. Failed spectacularly. The United Nations gave a governing body of sorts. Uh, Lived in New York City with Antoinette. I'm assuming that's his wife, until she died from a stroke on December 6, 1945, at the age of 81, and on December 27, 1948, at the age of 86, he died of pneumonia and heart disease in what is now Tiffany Cottage at the Guiano Club in Osterville, Massachusetts. Buried in the Bronx in New York City. Happy mixture of liberal conservative. Outstanding Secretary of State. Clear vision of America's position on in the new international system. Judge Learned Hand once observed that Hughes was the greatest lawyer he had ever known, except that his son, Charles Evans Hughes Jr., was even greater. Who was Judge Learned Hand? Billings Learned Hand. Okay. But yeah, that's been a look at Charles Evans Hughes. And that has been a look at the two justices that in the Melville Fuller court. Next episode for that, we'll be looking at the major cases of the Melville Fuller court, and then finally heading on to the next court, which is the Edward Douglas White court. But anyway, so yeah, remember a lot of the names. Edward Douglas White was an associate justice under Melville Fuller. So was Charles Evans Hughes. But Edward Douglas White would follow up Fuller as Chief Justice. There would be William Howard Taft to follow up Douglas White, and then Charles Evans Hughes would follow up William Howard Taft. So remember a lot of these names. We're starting to get into the modern era of the modern judges. Louis Brandeis, big name. You'll hear a lot of interpretations he makes and everything. So yeah. Harlan F. Stone. He, I think he would become a Chief Justice on his own. Harlan F. Stone. So we're starting to see a lot of your associate justices come in to be Chief Justices. And as you can see, we're already hitting the mid-1900s. Earl Warren, who oversaw the investigation into the death of John F. Kennedy. Thurgood Marshall. So yeah, we're making progress. Just the Fuller Court, so many justices we had to look at because a lot of them weren't on the bench for long at all. Anyway, thank you all for watching. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Not meaning to talk like William Shatner. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources, and it can't be tinfoil hat wearing sources or a bunch of anecdotes slapped together to try to make sources. Thank you all for watching. See you all in the next one. Until then, later.